So this is all about talking out thoughts, and I have some thoughts today, but they're even more disjointed than usual, so I don't think that I am going to arrive at any firm conclusions at the end of all of this. A few days back, I got to have a nice catching up talk with a dear friend of mine, former student, one of the most brilliant people I ever did teach, and one of the people who was not able to make it to my little 10-year shindig because he was sick, and he rightly stayed home and got better. But now we got to just chat, find out what we'd been up to, what we've been thinking over the past few months. And he is involved in the area and in the region with people who are deaf. He's a sign interpreter. And periodically he'll make reference to the community and talk about the community as though there is collective action and collective consensus. And I don't know, he might be able to set me straight and say that actually there is a fair amount of uniformity of opinion, but I'm very, very skeptical of that. On one or two occasions, he's made a remark, something along the lines of, the community has more or less decided, or the community believes. And typically, I am in that conversation to hear what's going on with him, not to get pedantic, so I don't stop him. But communities are like oceans. Sometimes it looks as though the channels that have been worn by the action of a large body of water, sometimes that can lead you to the misleading conclusion that that body of water is predictable. And I can imagine someone who built her house on the sea coast, on the coast of an ocean, saying, look at the marks on the rocks, look at how high the water stains go. The ocean apparently has decided to come this far, but no further. And that would be very, very risky. That would be downright foolhardy. Oceans do not make decisions. Oceans follow hydrodynamic forces. And in a very similar way, communities don't decide things. There are beliefs, there are interpretations that are popular. There are interpretations, responses to stimuli that are widespread that a lot of people embrace. But anybody who reaches a conclusion that a community has decided something is really kind of set up to be caught off guard. And the remarks my friend has made are not the kinds of things where I think he's out on a limb or he's going to get a rude awakening about anything. It's just what got me to thinking about this. Because I would have said just a year ago that we had collectively decided that certain conduct was not acceptable. We had collectively decided that certain ideas about race were dead, no longer had any merit, and anyone who voiced those ideas was not to be taken seriously. And I could have believed that we had reached an enduring consensus about that, and I don't anymore. And in the few days after the election, I talked as though the results of the election have been a sneaker wave. But really what I think I have been doing and a lot of other people have been doing is falling prey to the cognitive error of false consensus. I think we smoothed over the outliers, and I think that we believed what we wanted to believe. I think we cherry-picked what we were seeing to believe that as communities and as one larger community, one larger political unit, there were certain objectives and there were certain methods that we embraced and other ones that were over the line. That it didn't matter what short-term benefit, what short-term advantage we might get, we wouldn't resort to those. And today I don't believe that at all. So that's one of the things that I spent a lot of time thinking about this week. A second thing that I thought about a fair amount, this was a historical footnote that came out of nowhere. But there was a time back in Germany in the 1920s and in the 1930s when I think that a lot of German people understood that they were under a lot of economic stress, that their political order had been subject to strain that they hoped they would weather and endure and be able to move on from as soon as possible. I mean, they had just lost a war, and losing a war is a very traumatic event. Now, they lost it in the sense that they surrendered. They did not lose it in the sense that they were invaded and then the whole country had to be rebuilt. But still, that's got to leave behind a whole lot of collateral damage, a whole lot of turbulence that as you collectively deliberate, you have to work through. But Hitler was brought to power by popular vote, and Hitler could clean up pretty good, could give speeches that drew thunderous applause, and for a while at the beginning, probably did not look entirely unreasonable. And I've gotten very, very interested in at what moment did people who were loyal Germans, who considered themselves participants in social order, what was the breaking point? For the many who did take part in underground resistance, when did it crystallize for them? When did it become clear that it was necessary? I think with hindsight bias, we believe that that was an easy decision, that there was no struggle, there was no remorse. I know when I tried on the idea that it might actually be kind of wrenching, kind of tearing, to believe that you needed to undermine your own country because your own country was being led by someone whose decisions had gone hurtling over the line, had moved well past what was acceptable, to where you no longer had any choice. And if you continued to be loyal to your country, then you were complicit with the unspeakable. And we have used Hitler and the Nazis as our shorthand, as our easy, compressed reference for kind of a cartoonish idea of government that has to be resisted. I think we leave out what, for people who were alive at the time, must have been, in some ways, a very difficult change to make. And if I weren't into the school year now, when I honestly do not have any kind of free time, I think one of my objectives, and I may jot it down and see if I'm still interested in this next May, would be to go back and find memoirs and biographies of people who were living in Germany around that time, and see if there's anyone who recorded the sense of regret, the sense of struggle. I know there are very often passing references to it. You know, I'm a good German, I'm a good loyal German. One to throw in for trivia's sake, Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank, considered himself a very loyal German, and he was a decorated German soldier during World War I. When the secret police finally came and arrested him, and they found his medals, they actually said if you had come and turned yourself in and identified yourself as a decorated war hero, you would have been treated with some decency. And as for why that sticks in my head, no, it is not because I think that Trump is close to reaching Hitler-caliber wrongness. I think he's clumsy. I think he has terrible reasoning skills. I do think that he is dysfunctional enough and has so little self-discipline that he's not really a concentrated force. He can't even get his own party on his side. And so I find what he does depressing to think about because there are very real needs that are not getting addressed. But am I actively frightened of what Donald Trump is doing? I take it day to day, but right at the moment I'm not. The third thing that I got to thinking about this week: the media coverage of what Donald Trump has done most recently. The evidence, highlighting the language in the tweets, highlighting and putting into context the decisions, and then trying to set this up against the decisions he's made up until now, and which ones of these have relevance for the Robert Mueller investigation, and which ones of these are handling things like North Korea recklessly. All of that. people who are politically positioned about where I am, there is this implicit and sometimes explicit, sometimes out loud wondering about how much does it take? What does it take? How much evidence do you need that this man cannot discharge the duties of this office? And my thought in response to that is no evidence is ever going to be enough. Because what we are doing, to say it again, we are falling prey to the cognitive error of false consensus. We begin from the belief that other people will interpret what we observe the same way that we interpret it. And we have had already a whole lot of demonstrations that that is not true. We would not have been through the shock that we went through in the last presidential election if that were true on any level. No evidence is ever going to be enough because they view different things as evidence. And they have become skeptical of the very sources that I think are trustworthy. And people who believe as I do politically long ago overshot the what does it take mark. Because there's a big block of people who pay attention to mediated messages about government, messages I think are unreliable, but they have fit them into their narrative and they are comfortable with them. And they spent 8 years under Obama saying, what will it take? When will you see through this man? This is punctuation again, the idea of punctuation that comes up in conflict and comes up more generally in communication. This didn't start when I think it started. For people whose views about public life are just inexplicable to me, there was a start to this development and there was a crisis point, but the timeline for them is nowhere near what it is. It bears no resemblance to the timeline I have. And because of that, no deliberation on any of these issues is going to go anywhere until we have some sort of brainstorm, some sort of breakthrough on how to pay attention to our damaged, alienated relationship. The relationship of being fellow citizens in one community, in one political unit. These are not problems that we can kick down the road. These are not problems that we can multitask and deal with on the side while we're dealing with more immediate problems. These are not things that if we just score a couple of victories, do a lot of things that benefit a lot of people, we will like what we see and we'll learn to trust one another again. None of that will work. What we need, and I hate lingo like this, but it's the best word I can think of, we've got somehow to have a reboot. And to repeat myself again, I think that what I wish I had time to do would be to study history and find out if we've ever successfully done anything comparable to this before. My impression is we did do something moderately similar after the Civil War, that the polarization around the time of the Civil War did get that bad. But after the Civil War ended, whatever repair to the relationship happened, it sure didn't happen right away. And it sure didn't happen without a lot of pain and collateral damage and things actually getting worse for a while. And when there was a little bit more order and there was a little bit more open exchange of viewpoints, my general impression, not remembering any of the historic events in detail, but the period from Reconstruction through the early 20th century, the Gilded Age, all of that, was that we simply took some issues off the table, decided that they weren't polite conversation anymore, and when polite people didn't talk about them, there was no progress made. Which meant, once again, we were sowing the seeds for what happened later on in the 20th century. And so a lot of people of color went and fought for their country in the 1940s, were treated abominably. That set in motion forces through the 50s and into the 60s where the issues could no longer be ignored. The fact that there was a consensus, not a consensus, but the fact that there was kind of comfortable proceeding, orderly and well-mannered proceeding for part of the 20th century, I think, the early part of the 20th century, I think you would have to say that was like a family that tries to put a good face on everything, all the while they have problems under the surface that are tearing the family apart. So I don't know. It's not something that it's not something that makes me at all cheerful. It's a very, very deadening, dispiriting thought. But maybe the fact that all of this is out in the open, and maybe the fact that there's all this hostility and even complete lack of a place to begin, maybe one of the things that I have to admit is a silver lining about that is it's not deceptive. We're not pretending it isn't there. And maybe while there is this opening, this finite opening, maybe what's really needed, I spoke the word maybe 5-10 minutes ago, is a breakthrough. A way to approach this laterally and a way to think about it completely differently. But as for right now, I don't know what to say.